In today's video, we follow the emotional journey of a man in a MAGA hat who is unfairly rejected at a shelter, only to reveal he's been quietly supporting it all along. This story highlights the power of empathy, kindness, and breaking down biases. Don't miss this heartfelt moment of growth. It was a crisp autumn morning when Dave decided to take a stroll through his suburban neighborhood. The sky was clear, and the vibrant colors of the trees seemed to reflect the last vestiges of summer's warmth. It was the kind of day that made you appreciate the little things, the rustling of the leaves, the warmth of the sunlight, and the comfort of home. Yet, as Dave walked down the familiar streets, a storm was brewing, not in the sky, but in his neighborhood. Dave was in his late 50s, with short-cropped gray hair, a solid build from years of working as a retired police officer. He had long since left the uniform behind, but the pride of his career still lingered in the way he carried himself. He was a man who had dedicated his life to serving his community, earning the respect of his peers and the trust of those he had protected for decades. He was a regular guy, someone who enjoyed the peace and quiet of suburban life, far from the chaos of the city. Today, however, Dave wasn't just any regular guy. He wore a red MAGA hat, a piece of apparel that had become a symbol of political division in the United States. It wasn't just any hat for Dave, though. It represented his beliefs, his values, and his right to voice them. The hat had become a symbol of his pride in his country, in the things that he had fought for, and in the voice he had found as a voter. He didn't wear it to provoke, but rather as an expression of his own identity. As he walked, Dave passed a few familiar faces. He waved to an older couple walking their dog, exchanged a nod with a young mother pushing her stroller, and smiled at a group of teenagers gathered at a bus stop. The neighborhood felt like home until he reached Carla's house. Carla, his neighbor of 5 years, was a woman known for her fiery personality and vocal political views. She was someone who never shied away from making her opinions known, especially when it came to politics. She often held impromptu meetings in her backyard, where she would host heated debates, always at the center of attention, rallying for social justice and progressive change. She had never hidden her distaste for certain political figures, and she had made her views on the MAGA movement clear on several occasions. As Dave approached her house, he noticed Carla standing outside, facing the street with a scowl on her face. She was holding a small spray bottle, her posture rigid as if she was waiting for something or someone. Her eyes locked onto Dave the moment he stepped onto her block, and for a brief moment, their gazes met, each of them knowing exactly what the other represented. Dave felt a twinge of discomfort. He had known Carla for years, and while they didn't always see eye to eye, they had always maintained a level of respect. But that was before the politics of division had torn into their community, before the line between left and right became so stark that even neighbors couldn't converse without raising their voices. But today, he knew that this wasn't going to be one of those casual exchanges. "Dave," Carla said, her voice carrying an edge he hadn't expected. She stepped forward, holding the spray bottle out in front of her like a weapon. "I need to talk to you." "Carla, what's going on?" Dave asked, his tone calm but with an undercurrent of confusion. He couldn't understand why she seemed so agitated. "You can't just walk around here wearing that hat," she snapped, her eyes narrowing as she pointed at the red MAGA cap perched on Dave's head. "This neighborhood doesn't tolerate hate." Dave took a step back, his heart pounding slightly. He was used to standing his ground in difficult situations, but the way Carla spoke so accusingly, so heatedly, caught him off guard. He hadn't expected this kind of response from her. It wasn't the typical political debate they'd had in the past. This was something more personal. "It's just a hat, Carla," Dave said, trying to defuse the situation. He adjusted the cap slightly, the red color bright in the sunlight. "It's a symbol of my beliefs, nothing more. I'm not here to cause trouble." But Carla wasn't having it. Her gaze hardened, and she raised the spray bottle, aiming it directly at Dave. "I don't care what it means to you," she spat, her voice shaking with anger. "I don't want that kind of thing here. People like you are the reason we're divided. You wear that hat, you spread hate, and I won't stand for it." Dave was stunned. He had heard people call the MAGA hat a symbol of hate, but never before had it been used to describe him personally. To him, the hat was just a representation of his personal politics, nothing more. Yet, Carla's words were like a slap in the face. He had lived a life of service. He had worked for years to protect his community. And yet here he was being accused of something he never intended. Before Dave could respond, Carla stepped forward quickly and sprayed him with a harsh stream of water from the bottle. The cold mist hit his face and clothes, and he stumbled backward, shocked by the suddenness of the attack. The water wasn't the issue, it was the humiliation, the outright aggression from someone he considered a friend. "Take it off," Carla demanded, her voice now laced with contempt. "Take it off or leave. You're not welcome here with that hat." Dave stood frozen for a moment, water dripping down his face. His chest tightened, a knot forming in his stomach. The attack had caught him off guard, but more than that. It hurt in a way that went beyond physical discomfort. It wasn't the water, it was the rejection. The rejection of who he was. The rejection of his beliefs. The rejection of everything he had worked for. He took a deep breath, wiping the water from his face with his sleeve. He looked up at Carla, his eyes meeting hers. And for the first time, he saw the full force of her conviction. This wasn't just about politics. This was about something much deeper. This was about who she thought he was and who he had become in her eyes. "I'm not taking off my hat, Carla," Dave said, his voice firm. "I'm not the enemy here. I'm just a person with a different view. I never meant to hurt anyone." Carla didn't say anything in return. She simply turned and walked back toward her house, leaving Dave standing there in the yard, feeling more isolated than ever before. The cold water on his clothes seemed to seep into his bones. But it wasn't the water that left him chilled. It was the coldness between them now, the gap that had formed because of a simple piece of clothing. Dave remained on the sidewalk for a while, staring after Carla, still processing what had just happened. He hadn't expected this level of hostility, not from someone he had shared so many conversations with in the past. As he stood there, his thoughts spiraled. Had his beliefs really become so divisive? Had his right to wear a hat that represented his values really made him an enemy in the eyes of his own neighbor? In the silence that followed, Dave couldn't help but feel a sense of loss. It wasn't just the rejection. It was the realization that he could no longer be the person he thought he was. He had always believed that in his neighborhood, in his community, he was respected for who he was. But today, that belief had been shattered. Today, he was just another person judged by the label on his hat. Dave stood frozen on the sidewalk, the water from Carla's spray bottle still damp on his clothes. His mind was racing, his thoughts tangled in confusion and frustration. The sense of betrayal and humiliation he felt was so profound it almost made it hard to breathe. His neighbor, someone he had known for years, had treated him as if he were an enemy just because of a hat. It wasn't just about the hat, though. It was about the way people saw him, how a simple symbol, an item of clothing, could change the way others viewed him. His whole life, he had worked hard to be a protector, to stand for fairness, and to help those in need. But here, standing in his own neighborhood, Dave felt alienated, isolated, and misunderstood. He turned away from Carla's house and walked back down the sidewalk. His feet felt heavy, as if the weight of the situation had become too much to bear. The leaves beneath his feet crunched with every step. Yet the sound seemed distant, muffled by the thoughts swirling in his head. He had always prided himself on being a good man, on standing up for what was right, and now that sense of pride was in question. As he walked, Dave's thoughts turned inward. He remembered his time as a police officer, the years spent keeping the peace, helping to bring justice to his community, and working alongside people from all walks of life. The uniform had been a symbol of authority and respect, and he had worn it proudly. But now, the very symbol he wore, a simple red MAGA hat, was enough to make him a target. He had known that the hat could be divisive, but he never imagined it would bring such personal conflict. He didn't wear it to provoke or to hurt anyone. It was a symbol of his beliefs, of his commitment to certain values, and yet to Carla, it was a symbol of everything wrong with the world. Dave walked deeper into the neighborhood, the sound of his footsteps growing louder in the silence. He had come to a point in his life where he wanted peace and stability. He had retired from the police force, settled into his own home, and looked forward to the simple joys of life. But today, that sense of peace had been shattered. As he walked, he came upon a local cafe where he had often stopped for coffee in the mornings. It was a small, cozy place with a warm interior and friendly staff. Dave needed to clear his head, so he decided to stop in for a cup of coffee. As he entered, the familiar sound of the espresso machine and the hum of conversation filled the air. He approached the counter, where a barista greeted him with a smile. "Hey, Dave!" "The usual," she asked, already reaching for the coffee beans. "Yeah, sure. Thanks," Dave replied, forcing a smile. He took a seat near the window, the warmth of the cafe soothing his frayed nerves. But as he sat there, the sense of isolation continued to gnaw at him. He had never felt so disconnected from his community, from the people he had known and trusted for years. The worst part was that it wasn't just Carla. The judgment he faced in his own neighborhood, the way people looked at him because of that hat, was slowly making him question everything he thought he knew about the people around him. As he sipped his coffee, Dave's thoughts kept returning to Carla. Had she really seen him that way? As a symbol of hate, as someone who represented division? Was that all it took for her to reject him? The more he thought about it, the more he realized that it wasn't just Carla. There were other people who felt the same way. The MAGA hat had become a lightning rod for division, a symbol that evoked strong emotions and even stronger opinions. But in all of this, where did that leave him? His phone buzzed, breaking his train of thought. He pulled it from his pocket, seeing a message from his wife, Nancy. "How are you doing, love? I saw the news about the protest earlier. Are you okay?" Dave's heart sank. The protest, the rally where he had worn the hat in support of his beliefs. Nancy had always been supportive of him, but she had expressed concern before about his growing involvement in politics. He quickly typed a response. "I'm fine. Just a lot of things on my mind. Some unexpected things happened today." As he sent the message, Dave sat back in his chair, staring out the window. The sun was beginning to set, casting a soft golden hue over the streets. But despite the beauty of the moment, Dave couldn't shake the feeling of discomfort. He felt like an outsider, like he no longer belonged in his own community. Just then, the door to the cafe opened, and a group of people walked in. Dave recognized a few of them from the neighborhood people he had known for years, who had been friendly and cordial in the past. But as they walked by, Dave noticed something that made his stomach drop. They glanced at him, then quickly looked away. Some even muttered to each other in hushed voices. The judgment was palpable. It was as if he had become a stranger, someone they didn't recognize anymore. He knew that the hat was the source of it, but that didn't make it any easier to bear. He sat in silence for a while, watching the world go by outside. But then something caught his attention. The group that had entered the cafe earlier was now gathered near the door, talking amongst themselves. Dave could hear snippets of their conversation, and one comment stood out to him. "Can you believe that guy? Wearing that MAGA hat around here. He's not one of us anymore." Dave's heart sank. He had never felt so alienated in his life. The words stung more than he cared to admit. He was a man who had dedicated years to his community, a man who had stood for justice and fairness. And yet now, because of one piece of clothing, he had become the enemy in the eyes of the very people he had served. As he stood up to leave, Dave felt a sense of resolve forming within him. This wasn't just about the hat. It was about standing up for himself, for his beliefs, and for the community he had fought for all these years. He didn't have to be defined by anyone else's judgment. He had to be true to himself, even if that meant facing rejection and misunderstanding along the way. As he walked out of the cafe, the cool evening air hit him like a wave. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. But as he walked back to his home, he realized that the journey ahead would be more difficult than he had ever imagined. Would he be able to bridge the divide? To make his community understand that his beliefs were not about hate, but about love for his country and his fellow citizens? Only time would tell. But Dave knew one thing for sure. He was not going to let this rejection define him. Dave's steps were slow but purposeful as he walked back to his house, the sting of the earlier encounter with Carla still fresh on his mind. His posture was slouched under the weight of the harsh judgment and criticism. But his mind churned with a mixture of frustration, anger, and a deep sadness. The more he thought about what had happened, the more he realized that it wasn't just the MAGA hat that had led to the rejection. It was the assumptions people made about him, assumptions that had little to do with his character, his life's work, or the good he had done for his community. As Dave reached his front door, he paused, taking a deep breath before unlocking it. The warmth of the house enveloped him as he entered, the comforting smell of dinner wafting through the air. Nancy was in the kitchen, humming as she prepared a meal. Their two kids, Andrew and Lily, were playing in the living room. It was a scene of normalcy, of peace, and yet it felt like a distant reality for Dave. The world outside felt so much different, like an alien place where people saw him through the lens of political symbols, instead of as a person. He closed the door behind him with a soft click, trying to shake off the negative energy that had followed him home. As he walked into the kitchen, Nancy looked up from the stove, a gentle smile on her face. "How was your day, love?" she asked, her tone light but with a touch of concern. Dave took a seat at the kitchen table, rubbing his face in frustration. He didn't have the energy to pretend that everything was fine. "You won't believe what happened," he started, his voice strained. "Carla, she sprayed me with water, Nancy, right in front of my house, right after I was walking back from the rally, just because of the hat." Nancy stopped stirring the pot and turned toward him. Her expression softened with empathy, and she set the spoon down. "Wait, she did what?" she asked, her voice filled with disbelief. Dave sighed deeply, running his hands through his hair. "Yep, she saw the hat, and it triggered something in her. I don't know, maybe she thought I was the enemy. I tried to explain, but she just kept going on about how I was part of the problem. It wasn't just the hat, it was everything. It was the judgment, the assumption she made about me without even knowing me." Nancy placed a hand on his, her touch a small comfort. "I can't believe she did that. She knows you, Dave, she knows who you are." "I thought so too," Dave said, his voice tinged with hurt. "But in that moment, it was like I didn't exist anymore. Like I was some kind of enemy because of one piece of clothing. It's more than just frustrating, it's heartbreaking." Nancy remained silent for a moment, her hand still on his. She could see the hurt in his eyes, the same hurt that had started to appear whenever Dave faced the realities of this new world they were living in. Politics had always been divisive, but it had never felt so personal, so isolating. "I'm sorry, Dave," Nancy said softly. "I really am. I don't know what's happening to people, but we can't let this define us. You've worked too hard for this family, and for the people around you, for them to think less of you because of some hat." Dave nodded, but the weight of the situation was heavy on his shoulders. "I don't know if it's just the hat. It's like people don't even see me anymore. They see what they want to see: a symbol, an ideology, a stereotype. They don't see a man who's dedicated to making his community better, who's helped countless people in his career. They see a political label, and they act on it without ever asking questions." Nancy squeezed his hand, a firm reassurance. "You know who you are, and so do I. Don't let anyone take that from you." Dave smiled faintly, appreciating her support. But the truth was that he didn't feel like himself anymore. He didn't feel like the man who had served his community as a police officer for years. He didn't feel like the man who had helped local businesses thrive, who had worked on numerous charity events, who had always tried to do the right thing. Today, he felt like a stranger in his own home. As they ate dinner, the conversation shifted back to lighter topics. The kids shared their day at school, and Nancy told Dave about some of the challenges at work. But even as they spoke, Dave's thoughts lingered on the incident. He felt a nagging sense that things were changing faster than he could keep up with. He wondered if the world had always been this divided, and whether he had just failed to notice it. Later that evening, Dave went outside to the backyard to clear his head. The cool night air was a welcome relief, and he leaned against the fence, staring out at the stars. He had always found comfort in the simplicity of nature, in the quiet of the world when everything seemed overwhelming. But tonight, he couldn't escape the sense of disconnection. His whole life, he had been a man who believed in standing up for what was right, regardless of who disagreed with him. But now, it felt like those values were being challenged at every turn. He had always believed in the goodness of people, in their capacity for empathy and understanding. But that belief was now being tested in ways he had never imagined. A car drove by, and Dave noticed a group of young people standing on the sidewalk, some of them wearing similar MAGA hats, others wearing shirts emblazoned with political slogans. As he watched them, a thought occurred to him. Was this how the world was now? Was the divide so wide that it was impossible for people to just see each other as human beings? Could he no longer walk through his own neighborhood without fear of being judged, ridiculed, or worse? The sound of the front door opening pulled him from his thoughts. Nancy stepped outside, holding a cup of tea for him. She walked over and handed it to him, a quiet gesture that meant more than words could express. As he took the cup from her, he could see the concern still etched on her face. "I know this is hard," she said, her voice gentle, "but we have to keep going. We can't let the negativity take over. We have to keep showing up, keep doing what we know is right." Dave nodded slowly. He knew she was right, but in that moment, it was hard to see the way forward. Everything seemed clouded by the weight of judgment, the harshness of division, and the overwhelming sense that no matter what he did, it would never be enough. As they stood there, side by side, looking out at the world beyond their fence, Dave realized that the path ahead was uncertain. But one thing was clear: he couldn't let this defeat him. He couldn't let the world's judgments dictate who he was or what he stood for. He would keep fighting, not just for his beliefs, but for the community he had always believed in, even if it meant facing rejection and misunderstanding along the way. Dave knew that the only way forward was to keep going. The next day, Dave woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. It wasn't going to be easy, and the road ahead would likely be filled with obstacles. But he was determined to show the world that the man behind the hat was more than just a symbol. He was a man who cared about his community, his family, and the future of the country he had served for so many years. And for the first time in days, Dave felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Because no matter how divided the world seemed, he knew that the truth, his truth, was worth standing up for. The day after the confrontation with Carla, Dave awoke to a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. He had spent the entire night turning the events of the previous day over in his mind, trying to make sense of the situation. As much as he tried to put it behind him, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had been unfairly judged, the harsh reality that the world seemed to judge him based on a piece of clothing. The red MAGA hat lingered with him. The morning was quiet, the kids still asleep and Nancy preparing breakfast in the kitchen. Dave stood in front of the bathroom mirror, trying to steady his thoughts. He wanted to shake off the negative emotions, but they remained entrenched in his mind. He was a man who had dedicated his life to protecting people, to doing what was right. But now, it felt as though those very principles were being undermined by the political divisions in the country. As he dressed for work, Dave tried to remind himself that the world was full of people who saw beyond the labels, beyond the ideological divides. But as he stood there in his suit, staring at his reflection, the weight of the situation hung heavy on him. He couldn't help but feel like an outsider in his own life. "You okay?" Nancy's voice pulled him from his thoughts. She stood in the doorway, a concerned expression on her face. "Yeah, just thinking," Dave replied, forcing a smile. "I'll be fine. It's just, I'm not sure what to make of it all. Everything feels so different now." Nancy walked over and wrapped her arms around him, a comforting presence amidst his uncertainty. "You'll get through this," she said softly. "You always do. You've been through so much, and you've always come out stronger. This is just another hurdle. Don't let it define you." Dave nodded, grateful for her unwavering support. But deep down, he still felt that gnawing sense of injustice. The previous day's events had sparked something inside him, something that went beyond just being a MAGA hat wearer. It was about the principle of being seen for who you were, not just judged by the surface. It was about standing up for what you believed in, even when the world didn't understand. As Dave left for work, he didn't feel like the same man who had woken up that morning. He felt determined, almost driven by something deeper, by the need to show people that he was more than just a political label. He didn't want to be judged for the hat on his head. He wanted to be seen for the work he had done, for the life he had built, and for the community he had served. That afternoon, he had a meeting scheduled with his team at the local police department, and it was there that everything would change. The meeting was held in the small conference room at the department. It was a routine discussion about local issues, new initiatives, and plans for the upcoming months. Dave's mind, however, wasn't entirely on the agenda. He found himself distracted, thinking back to the previous day's encounter with Carla and the way people had treated him simply based on the hat he was wearing. His thoughts were interrupted when his colleague, Detective Linda Hayes addressed him directly. "Dave, I've got something to show you," Linda said, holding up a folder. She was a no-nonsense type of person, sharp and precise in everything she did. She slid the folder across the table, and Dave instinctively opened it. Inside the folder was a series of articles, local news coverage, and a few personal notes. As Dave sifted through them, his eyes fell on a headline that immediately caught his attention. Local business owner donates generously to homeless shelters. The article mentioned John Hargrove, a successful businessman in town, who had been making significant contributions to various community organizations, including the homeless shelter Dave had visited the day before. "What's this?" Dave asked, still unsure of the connection. Linda's eyes met his, her expression neutral. "It's about a donor. His name's John Hargrove. You may not know him personally, but he's a major player in town. We've received word that he's been helping a lot of causes behind the scenes, particularly with donations to shelters and food banks." Dave furrowed his brow, flipping through the rest of the documents. The more he read, the clearer the picture became. John Hargrove, the man he'd met at the shelter the previous day, was not only a donor, he was also the owner of several successful businesses around town, including a few that ran local charity programs. Suddenly, Dave's thoughts shifted. The man who had been rejected at the shelter, the man who had been so cruelly judged based on the hat he wore, was not just any ordinary guest. He was someone who had been quietly contributing to the very programs that had rejected him. The very shelter that had dismissed him was being funded, in part, by the very person they had turned away. Dave sat back in his chair, the weight of the realization sinking in. It was more than just a personal injustice. It was a glaring example of how people were so quick to judge others based on superficial traits, without knowing anything about their true identity. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Linda said, noticing the change in Dave's demeanor. "I think I've just realized something." Dave replied, his voice steady but his mind racing. "I met this guy at the shelter yesterday, John Hargrove, the guy with the MAGA hat." Linda's eyes widened as she processed what Dave was saying. "Wait, you mean the John Hargrove, the same guy who's been donating millions to local charities?" Dave nodded, his thoughts running faster than he could express. "That's him, the same guy who got rejected by the shelter." Linda leaned back in her chair, clearly taken aback by the coincidence. "That's unbelievable. What a world we're living in." Dave ran a hand through his hair, frustration rising. "It's not just about the hat. It's about the way we see people, how we jump to conclusions. This man has been doing more for this town than most of us even realize, and he gets rejected because of the way he's dressed." Linda didn't respond at first. She was still processing the information, but after a moment, she let out a slow breath and looked at Dave. "So, what are you going to do?" Dave's eyes narrowed with determination. "I'm going to find him. I'm going to apologize. I need to make it right." Linda nodded in agreement, her expression softening. "You're doing the right thing. Dave, it's never too late to make things right." Dave stood up, his resolve solidifying. He didn't know what the future would hold, but he knew one thing for sure: he was going to face this head-on. He would find John Hargrove, apologize, and hopefully help open the eyes of others in the community who, like him, had been too quick to judge. As Dave walked out of the conference room, his phone rang. The name on the screen made his heart skip a beat. It was John Hargrove. He picked it up quickly, wondering if the universe was giving him the chance he needed. "Mr. Hargrove?" Dave's voice was steady but filled with urgency. "Yes, this is John Hargrove. How can I help you?" Dave paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "Mr. Hargrove, I owe you an apology. I didn't know who you were when we met at the shelter. You were treated unfairly, and I'm deeply sorry for that." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Dave's heart raced as he awaited a response. Finally, John spoke. "I appreciate your apology. Dave, it's not every day someone owns up to their mistakes. But you should know that I've always believed in giving people second chances, just like you've done now." Dave let out a sigh of relief, feeling the weight of the past day lift from his shoulders. This was the first step in mending the hurt caused by judgment and division. Dave sat in his car, staring at the cell phone in his hand. His conversation with John Hargrove had been brief but meaningful. The fact that John had accepted his apology so graciously, without anger or disdain, left him feeling both relieved and ashamed. Dave had spent much of the day grappling with the weight of what had happened. But now, a sense of clarity was beginning to form. John's response had opened a door to something bigger, a realization about his own role in perpetuating a cycle of judgment. As Dave pulled into his driveway, he thought about what he had learned. John Hargrove wasn't just any man wearing a MAGA hat. He wasn't the villain Dave had imagined him to be. He was, in fact, someone who cared deeply about his community. Someone whose generosity had touched many lives. Dave's preconceived notions, shaped by the world's polarized political climate, had clouded his judgment, causing him to overlook the humanity of the man standing in front of him. And for that, Dave felt an overwhelming sense of regret. After stepping out of the car, Dave walked toward his house. The sky was turning a soft shade of pink as the sun began to set, casting a peaceful glow over the neighborhood. He had a moment to himself. A moment to reflect on how easy it was to fall victim to the trap of judging others based on outward appearances. He had allowed the MAGA hat to become a symbol of division, a barrier that kept him from seeing the person behind it. But now, after hearing John's side, Dave had come to understand that the truth was never as simple as it seemed. Inside, his wife, Nancy, was sitting at the kitchen table, flipping through a magazine. She looked up when Dave entered, offering him a soft smile. "How did it go?" she asked, noticing the serious expression on his face. "I spoke to him," Dave said, his voice filled with emotion. "John Hargrove. He accepted my apology. I don't think I expected him to be so understanding." Nancy set down the magazine and stood up, walking over to Dave. "That's good, right? You did the right thing." Dave nodded, but didn't feel entirely at ease. "It's more than just that, Nancy. I realized something today. I've been guilty of judging people for things that don't matter. Things like the clothes they wear, the hats they put on their heads. I let the hat become a symbol for all the things I didn't like, without ever asking myself why I felt that way." Nancy took his hand, her expression tender. "It's not easy, Dave. We all have biases. The important thing is that you're seeing it now. You're not the same man who woke up yesterday." Dave smiled at her words, feeling a sense of gratitude for her unwavering support. But despite her kind words, he still couldn't shake the feeling that there was more he needed to do. The conversation with John had been a start, but it was only the beginning. If he truly wanted to change, he would have to go beyond just apologizing to one person. He would need to examine his own biases, confront the prejudices that lay hidden within him, and make a conscious effort to see people for who they truly were, not just the labels they wore. Later that evening, Dave sat in his living room, the soft hum of the TV in the background. He reached for his phone again, scrolling through social media. But he wasn't looking for anything in particular. He was simply thinking, reflecting on what he had learned. As he scrolled, he saw a post from John Hargrove, thanking everyone who had contributed to the local shelter. It was a simple post, but it struck Dave deeply. It was a reminder that John's kindness and generosity were real, that they weren't just political statements, they were a reflection of the man he was. Dave tapped the screen, leaving a comment on John's post. "Thank you for all you do. John, I was wrong, and I'm grateful for your understanding. We all need to do better." It wasn't much, but it felt like the right thing to say. It felt like an acknowledgement of his own growth, an attempt to make amends not just for the mistake he had made, but for the future he wanted to build. A future where people saw each other as people, where the labels didn't matter, and where kindness transcended politics. The next day, Dave received a text from Linda, the detective he had spoken to earlier in the week. "Hey, Dave," the message read. "I heard about your conversation with John Hargrove. I just wanted to say, good job. It takes a lot to own up to your mistakes." Dave smiled at the message, feeling a sense of validation. It wasn't that he needed praise for doing the right thing, but it was comforting to know that others saw the effort he was making. "Thanks, Linda," he replied. "I'm still working on it. There's a lot to unpack." And he was right. The journey wasn't over. It wasn't just about apologizing to John Hargrove. It was about becoming a better person in every aspect of his life. It was about finding a way to be more empathetic, to be more understanding, and to stop seeing people through the lens of politics or preconceived notions. It was about making a conscious decision to be better. A few days later, Dave ran into Carla, the woman who had confronted him at the shelter while he was out running errands. It was an awkward moment at first, but this time, Dave didn't feel the same defensiveness that had gripped him during their previous encounter. Instead, he felt a deep desire to make things right. "Hey, Carla," he said, stopping in front of her. "I just wanted to say that I've been thinking a lot about what happened the other day. I'm sorry. I should have been more understanding." Carla blinked in surprise, clearly taken aback by his apology. For a moment, she didn't speak. Then, after a beat, she sighed, her expression softening. "It's okay, Dave. I shouldn't have been so quick to judge you either. I think we both made mistakes. I guess it's easy to get caught up in everything going on right now." Dave nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. "I've been realizing that it's not just about politics or labels. It's about treating people with respect, no matter where they stand." Carla smiled, and for the first time in a while, Dave felt like he had made a genuine connection, like he had made progress in his own personal journey. As he walked away from the encounter, Dave realized that this was what it was all about. It wasn't just about apologizing or acknowledging his mistakes. It was about learning from them and being open to change. It was about doing better for himself, for the people around him, and for his community. In the end, it wasn't the MAGA hat that mattered. It wasn't the politics or the labels. It was the person underneath, someone who cared, who was willing to listen, and who was capable of change. Dave had learned that lesson the hard way, but he was grateful for it, because in the end, that's what made all the difference.